Man's Search for Meaning, a Leadership Book Critique by Amanda Wasser. So first I'm going to start with an introduction. I graduated from James Madison University with a degree in health sciences. Currently, I'm a graduate student in the Student Affairs and Higher Education program here at Texas State. And right now, in addition to my coursework, I work in our counseling center as a graduate assistant. I do a lot with outreach and education, workshops, presentations, things like that. And I'm also a graduate intern in the Health Professions Office at the University of Texas at Austin, where I do coaching for professional health students. Through this class, I want to establish that I am knowledgeable about leadership through my experiences and what I have learned in the class thus far. Here is a picture of the front cover of the book. This is a revised and updated copy for the one that was published in the United States in 1959. The original was published in Austria in 1946, but this is just translated and easier to read. Why I chose this book. I've always been interested in World War II and the Holocaust. When I came across this book's summary, when I was choosing a book, I thought to myself, how can that relate to leadership? It was always also very interesting to me because I wanted to see what kind of leadership could be found in this book. I also liked that the story was from a man's own lived story rather than just reporting facts and statistics about how to be a good leader. I thought overall it gave me a new perspective on how to look at leadership and at life really. When I think of leadership, I usually think of leadership as one person or a few people leading a group of other people. While the author did do this at times, I think this book was mainly focused on how to be a leader of your own life, which is also a really interesting perspective. Introduction. While I mentioned before that I was wondering how this book could relate to my leadership class, I went into reading this book with a lot of questions. How can someone be a leader in such a tragic time? Who is this man leading? Was he giving hope to other inmates? How could he take care of himself if he was helping others? These are just a few of the questions that I was curious about going into this book. While the author in no way was trying to make this a pity story or a story where he felt sorry for himself, he had several main ideas that he wanted readers to think about. In the worst of times, it is important to find what is meaningful to you. What gives you hope and what will be the one thing that makes life livable for you? For him, it was the love for his wife, even though he knew that she was probably already dead. This book does appear to address other questions and concerns that I had. I will go into these points more later. I do believe that this book is very relevant today, even though it is older. It hits on a lot of good points that I think everyone should think about. Why am I living and what do I have to live for? Summary. I thought that this book was written from a very interesting perspective. Frankl was a psychologist who came to the camp with a manuscript of the book he was writing. It was immediately destroyed at the camp. One of the reasons he was able to keep going through the camp was because he wanted to recreate his book. I thought that Frankl's background made this book really interesting to read. He took a very psychological standpoint in all of his thoughts and actions. Upon entering the camp, Frankl describes the shock that everyone was in because of the horrible smells, the disgust, and the people there already who didn't even look like people. Upon arrival, they were put into two groups, those that looked capable of labor and those who didn't. Those who didn't look capable of labor were sent to a gas chamber never to be seen again. Here, the shock factor really kicked in for everyone. There was not much time to process what was going on, and everyone was really left in shock. People were left in a delusional state, thinking that they would somehow be saved. As time went on, death became more prevalent. Many of these thoughts were turned into suicidal ideations at the thought of never getting out of the concentration camp. This eventually leads into the second psychological state that is characterized by apathy. The second psychological stage. In the second phase of the book, Frankl writes of the everyday experiences that someone in the camp must endure. At this time, the shock factor has worn off and people no longer fear death. Being with loved ones is a thing in the past and their distant memories. Frankl describes instances of intense physical labor, the sleeping arrangements, and the scarce food that they received. He also described brief accounts of being on the good side of certain guards, which he thinks saved his life from time to time. Phase 2 of the book focuses a lot on Frankel's psychological thoughts throughout his time at the camp. He looks for meaning in his life. He is reminded of the love he has for his wife. He has conversations with her in his head, and this keeps him going. He gives examples of men who lost hope in everything and then shortly after passed away. He knows that the biggest source of psychological stress is the unknown. It is hard for many of the inmates to keep going because of the fear of the unknown. When will they be liberated? Will they ever be liberated? What is going to happen next? Once the inmate keeps focusing on the unknown rather than something to live for, he would surely die. Frankl makes comparisons to someone who is unemployed. A man who is unemployed will eventually become depressed, thus limiting his future options for getting a job. The third psychological stage. In the third and final stage of the book, the prisoners are liberated. They're scared of the world at first and think that it is going to be like what the camp is. However, they realize the world outside of the camp has stayed the same. They experience bitterness because of their time spent at the camp and because of the losses of their families. They are also disillusioned because they have been so far removed from what real freedom was like. Logotherapy. Frankl describes how he used logotherapy in the concentration camps in order to help other people. This form of therapy helps people search for meaning in their lives. This type of therapy addresses that individuals have control over their life and how they feel about a certain situation. They need to keep in mind that life's events are not always going to be fair and that they might be hard to work against, but it is important in these times to find meaning in life. Frankl also says that no matter what is happening in life, if you are optimistic, it will help you persevere no matter what the circumstances are. The 3 main lessons. Number 1, if you have a why to live, then you can bear almost any how. In the book, Frankl thought of his whys, his love for his wife, his unwritten manuscript, and it pretty much gave him the opportunity to succeed in the concentration camp and ultimately become liberated. Number 2, love is the ultimate and highest goal by which to live by. Like I said before, the love for his wife really kept him going, even though he knew she was probably dead. 3, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. So this kind of goes back to his view of logotherapy, of having that mindset and in your mind saying, I'm going to find a reason to live. I'm going to find a meaning for life. I'm not going to let this situation control me. I will control my behavior and the situation. Leadership concepts related to this text. These were some of the main takeaways that I found when reading this book that related to some of the concepts that we went over in class. I thought that Frankl took a very situational approach to leadership when he was in the concentration camp. He had a talent for knowing how to respond to the inmates around him. For example, he would tell certain people to focus on something that gave them meaning and not to focus on the unknown. He knew that if they put too much emphasis on things they had no control over, then they would eventually die. Northouse says, for leaders to be effective, it is essential that they determine where followers are on the developmental continuum and adopt their leadership style so they directly match their style to that developmental level. Frankl had to be careful how to talk to different inmates because they were all at different levels of how they processed the situation. Psychodynamic approach is also prevalent in this book. Northouse also states that, contrary to the writings of various management theorists who attribute organizational effectiveness to environmental constraints, psychodynamic approach defends the idea that psychological, social, and emotional processes between leaders and followers have a great influence and need to be taken into consideration. I think this is one of the most important concepts of the book because everything that Frankl does for his fellow inmates revolves around this leadership. Finally, the values that Frankl has can be demonstrated in his leadership style. While in the concentration camp, he uses the values that he obtained when he was a psychologist and applies them to his life and to the lives of others. Lichtenstein says, personal values impact leaders in at least 2 ways. 1, as a perceptual filter that shapes decisions and behavior, and 2, as a driver of their methods of creating value. Frankl made use of his value filter to make a decision to find the meaning of his life and to stick to it in order to keep living. He didn't let his environment affect his mindset. Critique. Although this book is hard to relate to because most of us reading have never been imprisoned in a concentration camp, it has many universal concepts for those that are in tough situations. Frankl's story of the concentration camp is important to outline because it gives us context into his leadership style and what had shaped it. The book is extremely easy to read and is very interesting. It is a story, and with any good story, it is suspenseful and makes you want to keep reading. The book is very clear and has a nice flow. It is mapped out in a way that is extremely easy to understand, with the beginning about his accounts in the concentration camp and moves to his way of being a leader and his way of thinking. This book was originally published in 1946 in Austria and then published in the United States in 1959. Yet today it is still being read and it inspires people and their way of thinking all over the world. It holds up over time, and even though the time period has changed, the main concepts hold up and always will. As long as a person is dealing with a tough situation, they have a choice in how they want to react to their environment. Recommendation. I absolutely would recommend this book to others. I think it has great underlying themes that anyone would be able to relate to. I've always been a person who chooses the way I approach situations and the way I feel to outside factors that I can't control. I try to find a meaning for myself that is greater than the present situation and one that I can focus on. Frankl does this to a greater extent with trying to stay alive, but overall it's the same concept. This type of book is really hard to read. The passages are graphic and unimaginable. However, I think it is a great narrative that highlights Frankl's way of leadership. This book is not your traditional leadership book. When I think of leadership books, or when I used to, I think of modern-day narratives or self-help books. However, this book opened my eyes to other ways of leadership. This way of leadership is not traditional at all, but I enjoyed learning about it. What Frankl taught some of those inmates ultimately saved their lives because they were able to find a meaning for their life. And finding your purpose and meaning in life is one of the most important things you can do, in my opinion. Thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation about A Man's Search for Meaning. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope I inspired you to give this book a read. It was a great one. Thanks, and have a good day.